Also, you can find in the Quran examples of Arabic idioms and figures of speech that could likewise be misunderstood by people who are not familiar with the Arabic language or the terminology of the Quran. So, for example, the Quran constantly has Allah speaking in a plural. Is God a plural? Heaven forbid. Obviously not. The Quran frequently mentions Allah as having a face, even hand, just like the Hebrew Bible does. So if in the Hebrew Bible we're going to say that such uses of terms as face and hand must mean that the Hebrew Bible is teaching that God has a body, then we might as well say the same thing about the Quran. Or we can be more consistent and say that in the same way that we don't believe that the Quran is teaching that God has an actual body just because it uses the term face and hand, so likewise in the Hebrew Bible, in Hebrew, many things have faces, and even the very word face is always plural. So if I refer to my face, I'm going to refer to it in plural even though I don't have various faces, but rather my one face expresses to the outside world different expressions of my will, so it kind of makes sense that it'd be plural even though that it's not actually three in one. I just have one face. So also the term face is used in the Hebrew Bible for the surface of something. So you could say the face of the waters, meaning the surface of the waters. Although what we see as the surface of the water is what we see, that's not the actual contents of the water, and so forth. You also find in the Quran, I recall an instance where it says that they throw Allah behind their backs, but it doesn't mean that they actually thought that Allah is some idol that they could throw behind their backs. But of course a Christian could have come along and say, oh, this is proof that the Muslims actually worship some idol that used to be called Allah, and that's why it says they throw him behind their backs. You can't actually do that with God. It's a figure of speech, of course. Another thing that you stated is in reference to Deuteronomy chapter 34, where the Torah records the death of Moses. This is also a very good point to bring up, but is also not as problematic as one may think at first glance. So in the same way that Moses is able to write about things that occurred before his birth, he's also able to write about things that happen after his death. That's not a problem if it's coming from the creator of the universe and not from Moses himself. If it were coming from Moses himself, then we would expect that Moses would say, and I will die in the future. But then if Moses is writing, and I will die in 5 months, and then I will be buried in so-and-so location, then we could say, oh, even though Moses wrote that it's going to happen, not as though it already happened, but we could say Moses wrote, I will die, so that means Moses is writing it as coming from his own mind and not from the Creator. But since the text is coming from the Almighty himself, it is not Moses talking about himself, it's the Creator giving us the picture of what occurred in the story of the revelation of the Torah to the world. There was an opinion among the ancient sages of Israel, long before modern atheistic textual critics, and long before followers of Muhammad were around, who noticed that this passage is unusual for the different contents of the rest of the Torah, and they had the opinion that perhaps this means that Yehoshua the prophet, the main leader of Israel who followed Moses, came after Moses, that perhaps he wrote this in the spirit of prophecy, and then it was joined with the text of the Torah. That's no change to the Torah. That just means that a record of the end of the story was put at the end. No big deal. Also, if you consider the fact that God himself commanded us to heed the rulings of the court that was established under Moses, if they made a ruling that this be joined in the Torah scroll, nothing added to or taken away in the name of the Torah. There are no commandments in this short little section about Moses' death. There's no adding to the commandments of the Torah, nor any taking away. That is no big deal. It's no bigger of a deal than to have the hadith as an integral part of your Islamic faith, even though the hadith is not actually a part of the Quran itself. And of course we know that there are, if one is Sunni, then it's not going to be an issue. You're just going to say, oh, they're kafir, they're heretics. But objectively speaking, there are similar issues even with the Quran not only with the hadith.